Every winter, people die on the streets of this country because they trusted the shelters they were given. Cardboard, tents, emergency mylar blankets, thin as a whisper. They did what they were told, slept where they were pointed, and they froze anyway. But there was one man, no house, no job, no one listening to him, who dug a hole in the earth that the people around him called stupid, called dangerous, called the most ridiculous thing they had ever seen. They laughed at him for weeks. They took pictures. They gave it a name. They called it the Fool's Hole. Then the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and not a single one of those people was laughing anymore, because Marcus was the only one who was warm. His name was Marcus. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, with hands that looked like they had worked for decades because they had. He had spent 12 years in construction before the injury that took his livelihood, and 8 years on the streets of a mid-sized Midwestern city after the system decided that was not its problem. He camped on the edge of a scrubby public park near an industrial district, close enough to the rail yard that you could hear the freight trains groan through the night. The other people in that informal camp knew him as steady, not loud, not complicated, a man who kept his space clean and minded his own business. In October, when the first hard cold rolled in off the plains and the other people in the camp started layering up their cardboard walls and begging for extra tarps at the outreach van, Marcus did something different. He started digging. He used a broken-handled spade he had found in a dumpster behind a landscaping company. He dug every morning, methodically, moving no more than he had to, setting the excavated dirt off to the side in a careful pile. He dug down 5 feet, then 6, then he started widening. People stopped and watched. Some asked what he was doing. He told them he was building shelter. They looked at the hole and they laughed. One man named Terry, who everyone in the camp liked and who meant no real harm by it, started calling it the Fool's Hole. And the name stuck. What did they see when they looked at that hole? A pit, a grave maybe, a waste of energy by a man who could have been spending those hours in line at the warming center. The social worker who did Thursday outreach rounds stopped one morning, looked at the excavation, and told Marcus in a gentle, professional way that this was not a viable solution, that underground structures were structurally dangerous, and that there were beds available. Marcus thanked her, kept digging, and started framing the walls with salvaged wooden pallets. People shook their heads. But here is where the story turns. Here is where everything those people assumed about shelter, about heat, about what it means to survive, gets quietly, completely demolished. Before we get into what Marcus actually built and why it works so well that a polar vortex could not touch him, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever watched someone do something different, something that looks strange or wrong on the surface, and later realized they knew something you did not? Drop your story below, because what you are about to discover will change how you think about warmth, survival, and who actually gets to decide what is smart. Here is what most people don't understand about how human beings have kept themselves warm for the overwhelming majority of their existence on this planet. It wasn't fire alone. It wasn't fur. It was the earth itself. For tens of thousands of years, across every cold climate civilization, from the steppes of Central Asia to the tundra of Scandinavia to the high plains of the American interior, people dug into the ground to survive winter. The Mandan and Hidatsa peoples of the northern Great Plains built earth lodges, massive domed structures sunk several feet into the soil that could house extended families through winters that made modern blizzards look mild. Indigenous Siberians built pit houses so effective that a single oil lamp could maintain a livable interior temperature when it was brutally cold outside. The sod house settlers of the Nebraska frontier were mocked by Eastern newspapers when they arrived, called primitive, called backwards. Then the winters came, and the sod houses held, and the frame houses with their thin walls and drafty windows did not. The modern world looked at all of this accumulated wisdom and decided it was a sign of poverty, something to move past, something to replace with insulated fiberglass and sheet metal and heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems that run on electricity that cuts out precisely when you need it most. And the moment we made that trade, the moment we moved entirely above ground and decided that the earth was something you built on top of, not something you built inside of, we became fragile in a way our ancestors simply were not. Here's the physics. And pay attention, because this is the piece that makes everything else click. The ground has a temperature, not the surface, which fluctuates wildly with the seasons, but the ground at depth, below the frost line, which in most of the northern United States sits somewhere between 2 and 4 feet down. At that depth, the Earth maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round. It hovers in the range of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit in most temperate climates, regardless of what the atmosphere is doing. Think of it like a battery that spent the entire summer storing thermal energy and now refuses to let it go. That stored warmth does not respond to a polar vortex. It does not respond to wind chill. It does not care that the jet stream has collapsed and sent Arctic air screaming south at 50 miles an hour. It just holds. This is the principle behind every ancient pit house, every earth lodge, every ice fishing shanty dug down into a frozen lake. It is the same principle that makes caves maintain a constant temperature. It is the reason root cellars worked before refrigeration, and the reason the best root cellars are still keeping food at 45 degrees in July without a single watt of power. The Earth is a thermal mass, and thermal mass is the oldest insulation in the history of the world. Marcus understood this, not from a textbook, but from 12 years of construction work that included foundation excavation, from watching the way frozen ground behaved, from a deep observational intelligence that no one around him was bothering to credit. He dug 6 feet down. He framed the walls with doubled pallets to create dead air space, and dead air, trapped and still, is one of the most effective insulating materials in existence. The same principle behind double-pane glass and down jackets. He roofed it with salvaged corrugated metal laid over a lattice of branches, heaped the excavated soil back on top to a depth of 8 inches, and weighted the whole thing with a tarp and more soil on top of that. The entry was a narrow horizontal tunnel, angled slightly downward at the mouth so that cold air, which sinks always because it is denser than warm air, would pool at the lowest point of the entrance rather than flooding the main chamber. That is not an accident. That is deliberate cold air trapping, a design feature found in traditional Arctic and subarctic shelters going back centuries. Here is where it gets remarkable. Inside that structure, with one small candle lantern burning for light and a single body generating heat, one human being, 5 feet 10 inches, 53 years old, the interior temperature stabilized at around 58 degrees Fahrenheit. On a night when it was 12 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit outside, he was not cold. He was warm enough to sleep without shivering, warm enough that his core temperature stayed stable, warm enough that he woke up rested. The other people in the camp had 6 inches of cardboard between their bodies and air that wanted to kill them. Cardboard has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance of roughly 0.5 per inch. 6 inches of cardboard gives you an R value of about 3. A typical residential wall with modern insulation runs R13 to R21. Marcus's earth shelter, with its combined layers of soil, dead air framing, and thermal mass, had an effective R value estimated by engineers who later examined similar structures to be somewhere between R30 and R50. He had not just outperformed cardboard, he had outperformed most modern residential construction, and he built it with a broken spade and salvaged lumber. If you're finding this valuable, if something about this is making you rethink what you were told about warmth, about shelter, about where real solutions actually come from, hit the like button because there's more coming and it matters. Now let's talk about why nobody builds like this anymore. Why the knowledge that kept human beings alive through ice ages and brutal winters got quietly shelved, and why the people who still use it are treated as eccentric at best, dangerous at worst. Three things happened in the 20th century that made underground and earth integrated shelter disappear from the mainstream. First, speed. Building a proper earth shelter takes time, days, or weeks of careful excavation and framing. Industrial construction moved to methods that could produce a structure in a single day of poured concrete. Time is money, and the construction industry decided it did not have time to be patient. Second, cost. Earth shelters require skilled labor for proper waterproofing and drainage, and skilled labor had to be paid. Thin-walled above-ground construction used cheaper materials and less expertise per unit. Profit margins were better, so the industry chose margin over performance and sold you the result as progress. Third, the zoning and building code infrastructure of the 20th century was written almost entirely around above-ground structures, not because underground structures were dangerous, not because they did not work, but because the industries that lobbied for those codes sold windows, electrical systems, HVAC units, and roofing materials. An earth shelter does not need most of that. And that was the problem. The people who paid the price for that decision were not the developers. They were not the lobbyists. They were the people at the bottom, the people with the fewest options, the thinnest walls, the cardboard between their sleeping bodies, and a night approaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They were the people who got handed emergency thermal blankets by well-meaning outreach workers and told that was the solution that was designed not for warmth, but for liability, not for survival, but for a line in a budget report. That failure was not their fault. The system was built to funnel them toward products and services, and away from the kind of old, free, stubbornly effective knowledge that Marcus had spent 6 weeks reconstructing with his hands. The night the polar vortex arrived, the temperature at the official weather station downtown dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chills put the effective temperature at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Emergency alerts went out. The warming center on 5th Street opened its overflow capacity. Terry and several others from the camp made it there. 2 people did not make it anywhere in time. Marcus crawled into his tunnel, pulled the insulated flap, 2 layers of moving blanket he had stuffed with crumpled newspaper across the entrance, lit his candle lantern, and went to sleep. In the morning, he emerged into a world that had tried its absolute hardest to kill everything exposed to it. He was fine, he was warm, he was, by every physiological measure, more rested than he had been in years. So what do you do with this? Here is the practical part, and it matters whether you are thinking about homelessness, disaster preparedness, or simply understanding what real resilience looks like. If you want to explore earth-integrated building for yourself, start with the concept of thermal mass. Look into earth bag construction, which uses polypropylene bags filled with soil to create walls with enormous thermal stability and which can be built by 2 people with no construction experience. Organizations like the Natural Building Network and CalEarth have documented these techniques exhaustively, and much of it is available for free. If you want something even more accessible, research the traditional root cellar design, a buried chamber with a baffled entrance, and notice how precisely it mirrors what Marcus built. The principles are identical, the performance is identical, the cost is almost nothing. If you want the minimum, if you take nothing else from this, at least understand the frost line in your region. Understand that below it, the earth is your ally, not your enemy. The ground holds warmth like a promise. Every culture that survived brutal winters for thousands of years before the invention of fossil fuel heating knew this, and someone decided to make you forget it. Marcus was not primitive. He was not desperate or foolish or lucky. He was a man who had been stripped of almost everything and had gone back to first principles, to the oldest knowledge there is, and had built something that worked when everything else failed. They called it the Fool's Hole. He called it home. The knowledge was not lost. It was buried, and this time that is exactly where it kept someone alive. We dig into the survival wisdom that the modern world left behind, the techniques, the physics, the old ways of doing things that still work when everything new falls apart. If this is the kind of knowledge you want more of, subscribe and join us. And tell us in the comments, what survival topic do you want us to investigate next? What piece of old world knowledge do you think deserves to be uncovered? We're listening.